This is where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers converge, and just north of it is Cairo, Illinois. The southernmost city of Illinois. Should you find yourself unlucky enough to have to cross the Cairo, Mississippi River Bridge or the Cairo, Ohio River Bridge to get to where you're going, you'll be greeted with this Welcome to Illinois sign, which is also a sign in of itself of what's waiting down the road. But before we can explore Cairo for its breathtaking beauty and deep lore that rivals that of cities like Paris and Tokyo, we need to establish some context for Cairo's existence to begin with. The first colonial explorer to step foot upon the land that became Cairo was that of Belgian Catholic priest Father Louis Hennepin, who was also the one to discover the Niagara Falls and report its existence back to Europe. The first time the land saw any sort of development was in 1702 when the first colonial Frenchmen settled in the area, using the land as an early fort and production base. This first wave of Frenchmen, supported by King Louis XIV, was tasked with establishing a tannery and, by extension, to slaughter as many buffalo as possible. Their efforts went on unabated for about a year, leading to the death of at least 13,000 buffalo, the main source of sustenance for the local tribes. In response, taking matters into their own hands, the Cherokee and other nearby tribes rallied together to annex the fort, killing most of the men in the process, confiscating their ill-gotten skins on the way out. Before Cairo could even be, the land was stained with blood and colonial ambition. A century after the French's defeat in 1803, Cairo once again saw another wave of Europeans, this time involving that of Captain Meriwether Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark of the famed Lewis and Clark expedition, who traversed the land before starting their expedition in St. Charles, Missouri, just about 140 miles away. Following the charter, a friend of the captain, an enigmatic man from Baltimore named John G. Cummings, saw potential in the land and decided to make something of it for himself. And so, sometime between 1817 and 1818, Cummings went down to the Kaskaskia land office, Kaskaskia being the capital of Illinois at the time, where there he purchased 1,800 acres of the land that became Cairo, a name that he chose for himself. His reason for doing so? Southern Illinois, in particular the historic wetlands of the Cass River complex, was known especially at this time as Little Egypt. For a few reasons, though most likely of all thanks to the fact that Egypt was extremely culturally relevant in the West during this time, following Napoleon's campaigns in the region at the end of the 18th century. Or another way of putting it, Egypt then was how we view Japan today. Given that the geography of the purchased land was somewhat reminiscent of that of Egypt's capital alongside the Nile, Kamaji saw fit to name it Cairo, albeit with a different pronunciation. Unfortunately, Kamaji would die very soon after, between 1819 and 1820, for reasons unknown today, and with his estate unable to afford the land, the United States government repossessed it, although the name would remain. The next person to come along and attempt to make something of Cairo was that of Darius B. Holbrook, who in 1837 established the Cairo City and Canal Company. Holbrook and his team of men, 100 strong, took to rapidly developing Cairo, with the construction of everything including dry docks, a shipyard, a farm, a hotel, a store, and of course many homes, not to mention a new levee system which would protect the land from erratic and catastrophic flooding. Despite a sizable population of around 1,000 by the end of 1840, Holbrook's attempts at creating a sustainable growing community failed, with just less than 200 people remaining after 2 years, a consequence of the financial ruin following the collapse of the London investment firm that was responsible for Holbrook's funding. In 1845, a census revealed that the city's population had halved yet again, with just 113 people calling Cairo their home. Charles Dickens visited the city in 1842 and hated it, describing it in his American Notes for General Circulation to be a dismal swamp on which half-built houses rot away, cleared here and there for the space of a few yards, and teeming, then, with rank unwholesome vegetation, in whose baleful shade the wretched wanderers who are tempted hither droop and die and lay their bones, the hateful Mississippi circling and eddying before and turning off upon its southern course a slimy monster hideous to behold. A hotbed of disease, an ugly sepulchre, a grave uncheered by any gleam of promise, a place without one single quality in earth or air or water to commend it. Such is this, the dismal Cairo. The city would go on to serve as a main inspiration for the city of Eden in his novel Martin Chuzzlewit. Holbrook remained determined in reversing the decline of Cairo through the 40s and 50s, up until his persistence finally paid off in 1856, when the recently formed Illinois Central Railroad Company officially connected Cairo to Galena, Illinois, the passenger depot once at this very spot. This all in conjunction with increased boat traffic from the growing trade and transport industry skyrocketed Cairo's population, with the city 2,000 strong by the end of 1858. And it wasn't just goods that were transported through Cairo during this time, as the city had unknowingly become an important destination for the Underground Railroad, providing passage to escaped slaves trying to make it to nearby cities in the north. The scope of these operations would be further unveiled in June of 1998, when city workers discovered the network of rooms and main tunnel utilized in the Cairo chapter of the Underground Railroad under the street the Illinois Central Railroad used to operate on, making it quite literally an underground railroad, which, mind you, is not typical like the name may suggest. Life continued on as normal for the citizens of Cairo leading up to the Civil War, the city a growing destination spot for wealthy travelers looking to spend their money at the various clubs and gambling spots offered. As the riverboat traffic boomed, Cairo's reputation as a hub of transport and vice grew ever more cemented. That is until April 12, 1861, when the recently conceded Confederacy attacked Fort Sumter, a base in South Carolina occupied by Union troops, and with so kicking off the Civil War. Just 5 days later, following rumors of a potential attack by the Confederate governor at the time, Richard Yates, dispensed 600 untrained troops to the region, soon followed by 7 volunteer companies. There, among the first actions they took was blockading travel, disrupting commerce, and ultimately crippling the Confederacy's means of economic production. In the preceding months of Fort Sumter's attack, the Union further entrenched their establishments along these very banks, with thousands of soldiers and dozens of boats to show, including the Tyler, Lexington, and Conestoga. These ships were equipped with artillery and fuel pieces, not to mention other means of artillery, making them among the first gunboats to exist. On August 28th, just 6 weeks after the attack on Fort Sumter, General Ulysses S. Grant was tasked with strengthening the Union's defenses across the General Region's rivers. Cairo, already a base of military operation, not to mention its reputation during civil operation, appealed to Grant, and so he officially established Camp Prentiss in 1861, named after the commanding officer, General Benjamin M. Prentiss. Though just after a year, Grant replaced Prentiss with Brigadier General John Alexander McClernand, and Camp Prentiss was renamed to Fort Defiance. While the fort may be no more, the surrounding land was converted into a state park, Fort Defiance State Park, for those who maybe want to walk their dog. While there's not much going on here anymore, the land was once grounds for a vital base for the Union. Fort Defiance served mostly as a naval station and home port, in addition to being a supply and logistics depot for the Army. Boats of every kind and purpose lined these waters. With land of limited resource, faculties that would otherwise usually be on land were on boat, such as barracks, storage bays, and repair shops. The city saw its population break 12,000 during the war, though of course the vast majority were military personnel. While Cairo may have never hosted any battles or seen much blood, the city and fort within it were one of many key points for the Union in securing its ultimate victory. Despite Cairo's important role, its usual purpose of serving as a hub of civil trade and transportation was no longer possible during wartime, and so such business directed elsewhere to nearby cities such as St. Louis and especially Chicago. This was the first major nail in the coffin for Cairo's lack of purpose in the years to follow. With the war eventually ending, so went the soldiers, and some 3,000 freed slaves settled down in the city. Despite the drastic population cut, some still had eyes on Cairo as a potential future megahub, a continuation of its status before the war. However, its geography and the violence to come would prove too burdensome for any aspiring town. Cairo, no different. Speaking of geography, what is it about the land that Cairo sits upon that makes it so difficult for growth? Crazy flooding. Cairo obviously sits between 2 rivers at a low elevation, and the land was already known for its predisposition to flooding by the natives and explorers before Cambyses' time. Because of so, levees were built on both ends of the city to serve as a barrier against the rivers. However, the levees were very unreliable, and the city still struggled with constant flooding. The city had seen numerous mass flooding events up until then, but the worst came on June 12, 1858, when the Mississippi River levee gave way, ultimately engulfing the city in at least 12 feet of water, resulting in hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of damage and the death of many. The wrath of Mother Nature not yet satiated, an even more catastrophic flooding event was barely averted. Residents worked en masse to expand and fortify the Ohio River levee under a ticking clock. Their efforts prevailed, and the city was spared flooding upwards of 14 feet. Despite improvements in the infrastructure with time, Cairo still remained at the mercy of the rivers, with flooding still a common occurrence, though none quite racked up the kill count like the 1858 event did. Such an unstable geography tarnished any hope for Cairo's long-term growth or success. However, as we'll get to, the geography was only merely another nail in the coffin for the city's future. With the end of the war and the exodus of troops, came increased investment into Cairo, primarily in strengthening its industrial and manufacturing capacity in addition to its already established transport and logistics-based economy. However, despite a seemingly promising future as a humble hub between cities, the settling down of some 3,000 former slaves proved too much for the white people of Cairo. Making up around 40% of the population in Cairo and white residents refusing to integrate, black residents were forced to essentially build a city within a city, new schools, churches, businesses, and culture. This dichotomy of a city entrenched already existing race tensions, though it was really white folks who had a problem coexisting with the freed slaves. The black community of Cairo was obviously extremely close-knit and politically active, with very high union participation rates and common activist organization. Black residents of Cairo were outspoken and steadfast in their fight for rights and representation as segregated city, a through line that only grew more intense as the black population grew. This status quo of uneasy coexistence remained through to the end of the 19th century, up until 1905, when this railroad bridge was constructed in the neighboring town of Thebes as a new point of trade and transport. Such a development proved devastating for the economy of Cairo, as much of their business relied on traffic that was now being directed elsewhere. Such a change proved too much for the white residents of Cairo, who were now even more poor and resentful, and whatever contempt they held for the black residents of Cairo turned to violence. In 1909, a 24-year-old white woman named Anna Pelly was found dead, having been raped and murdered. A black man, William Froggy James, was accused of the crime despite zero direct evidence, and on November 11th, an angry mob congregated seeking extrajudicial punishment. Cairo's sheriff hid James in the wood, hoping to prevent the mob from finding him, but such attempts ended up futile. And so, upon his discovery, the mob dragged him here, the former center of the town at 8th Street and Commercial Avenue, where they tied him into a noose and hung him upon the steel arches that once stretched across this intersection. The noose broke, and James fell to the ground, still alive. This enraged the mob even further, and so they shot the man over 500 times before dragging the corpse to the site of Anna's death, where they then set it on fire, all to a crowd of over 10,000 people. the population of Cairo at this time being only about 14,000. Not done yet, the mob dismembered the burned carcass and stuck the head on a pike, William's other extremities taken by participants of the mob as twisted souvenirs. You'd think the mob would be done by now, but you'd be wrong. Their thirst for blood remained unsatiated. And so, following James's murder, the mob marched down to the county jail, where accused of wife murder Henry Salzner sat in detention, unaware of what was to come. The mob stormed the jail, removed Salzner from the cell, dragged him to the same city center, lynched him, and then shot him several times for good measure. During all of this, both Cairo's mayor and the police chief remained barricaded away in their homes, and Illinois' governor at the time, Charles Deneen, was forced to call in the National Guard to intervene in the madness. The violence in Cairo never ceased following November 11th, with just less than a year later, another black man being lynched for stealing a white woman's purse. This time around, a sheriff's deputy attempted to intervene on behalf of the accused, although he was quickly murdered for daring to stand up to the mob. In 1907, the city's population peaked at about 15,000, and a decade later, by 1917, Cairo's reputation was that of only violence, with the city holding the prestigious title of the most dangerous city in the state. The city's population by this point had been rapidly declining, but despite so, violence persisted. Cairo's economy, or whatever was left of it, was effectively snuffed out for good come the Great Depression, and the city was left to decay. Following the end of World War II, Cairo saw some semblance of life once again, though the only activity the city attracted was that of the illegal variety. Underground gambling rackets and illicit bootlegging operations fueled Cairo's non-existent economy. The city, even in the dawn of the civil rights movement in a progressive state like Illinois, remained a hotbed of racial tension, though black residents continued their tradition of strong self-advocation, especially during the civil rights movement. In 1946, black teachers of Cairo took legal action against the city to secure equal pay and treatment across racial lines. The teachers were represented by no other than Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice. The case served as one of the earliest hallmarks of the civil rights movement, with it one of Thurgood's 29 of 32 successful lawsuits that ultimately culminated in the 1954 Supreme Court decision on Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. Despite societal advancement from the civil rights movement, Cairo remained stubborn and catching up to changing times. For example, despite the aforementioned Brown v. Board of Education decision, Cairo's schools didn't see integration until 13 years later in 1967. Even amidst growing pressure from black residents of Cairo alongside a changing America, white Cairo residents resisted change, going so far as to degrade their own quality of life so as to not cede way to the scary black folk they lived alongside with. For example, when citizens protested the segregation at the public town pool, rather than just allowing them to join in on the fun, the city opted instead to shut down the pool and fill it with concrete. The government of Illinois was well aware of Cairo's shenanigans and repeatedly threatened to sever financial ties with the city, including an instance in which banks were adamant in refusing to hire black employees. Cairo's sad state of affairs limped on up until 1967 when the final straw broke the city's back. Robert Hunt, a 19-year-old black resident, was thrown in jail on disorderly conduct charges, where there, he purportedly committed suicide. Black residents of Cairo believed the death to be under more malicious circumstances, and race tension boiled into race war. Black protesters were met by white vigilante quote-unquote counter-protesters, and the violence culminated into several fire bombings and sustained shootouts. The National Guard eventually intervened after a few days, though violence remained a staple of the city for the years to come. In fact, the violence was so bad that according to the Washington Post, in 1969, there was a 170-day streak of continuous sniper fire in the city. Because of this, all the city's high school sports teams had to play away, as every competing city refused to play in Cairo for reasons that can only be speculated. During this time, an extremist group formed in Cairo calling themselves the White Hats, an uninspired and unoriginal offshoot of the KKK. The group heavily harassed black residents of Cairo, threatening severe violence against any of those who may congregate in any way, even if just such congregations were for harmless activities like sports or other cultural practices. In response, the citizens of Cairo, though mostly black residents, have formed the United Front in Cairo, an organization dedicated to the boycott of the local white businesses. Despite the best efforts of the white business owners to survive the boycotts, their efforts were to no avail, as businesses began to close one by one as decay took over the city for the final time. By 1970, Cairo's population was half of what it was in 1920. Race tensions and violence persisted, and whatever life was left in Cairo by 1970 continued to slowly bleed out into the husk it is today. Today, Cairo has a population of less than 1,700, and the city is effectively dead. With nil economic or cultural output, a marred history, and geography unfit for a sustainable city, Cairo is best assumed to have no future. Now that we're done exploring that truly decrepit city, we can go over one more thing, and the thing that really matters, the intriguing doors that we encountered during our time in Little Egypt. I've always enjoyed strange and curious doors, and so a couple years ago, I dedicated myself to recording any and all intriguing doors I may come across, Cairo no exception. Well, that's it. That's the end of our time here. Cairo is a town that could have had a lot of potential. At the convergence of the Mississippi River and Ohio River, Cairo could have existed as a small but relevant hub of trade and transport, just as it did pre-Civil War. but its geography proved too detrimental and its people too hateful for the long-term success of the city, and so it remains today as a sad and decaying monument of an unfortunately not so distant America. This is my first actual YouTube video, so I'm still trying to figure these things out, as I'm sure you could see or definitely hear. Regardless, if you somehow managed to make it this far despite the production value that I subjected you to, then I sincerely greatly appreciate it, and any and all criticism is greatly appreciated. Thank you very much again for watching. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one, but until if then, be metal.